Welcome to the School of Education, Dr. Penny L. Hamrick Doctoral Student Colloquium Series presentation, renamed last year in memory of former Dean Penny L. Hamrick. The Doctoral Student Colloquium Series was created by Dr. Hamrick in 2016 when she served as Associate Dean of Graduate Affairs and Program Director for the School of Education's PhD and EDD programs. I am Christy Kelly, and I'm going to be the moderator this evening. We're so pleased to welcome all of our virtual attendees, including School of Education faculty and staff and students, and perhaps even an alumni or two, the university body at large, community members, and partner associations, among others this evening. The Colloquium series offers School of Education doctoral students and alumni an opportunity to share their original research and learn from their peers, faculty, and staff. Each month, one EDD, excuse me, and one PhD student presents their research at the Colloquium. These sessions help doctoral students to connect with each other and develop a peer community that is invaluable in supporting their journeys in the program. Each doctoral student or alumni presenter is also asked to write a research brief that relates to their presentation, which is then included in an edited publication titled Doctoral Student Research Briefs. This is published on the School of Education's website. The research brief is a way to disseminate our doctoral students' research as shared in the colloquium in a concise format with relevance to education. So tonight, each presenter will be provided with 20 minutes to share their research. We will then move on to questions and answers following each presentation. Please save your questions for the end. You're welcome to type your questions in the chat area of Zoom or use your mic afterwards to ask the question. So let's introduce our first presenter. Our first speaker is Natalia Brand, and their presentation title is The Untold Struggle, a literature review on mental health and its influence on school shooting incidents. Natalia is a PhD student in the School of Education at Drexel and holds an EDS in school psychology from the same institution. Her academic journey began with a Bachelor's of Arts and Sciences degree in cell biology and neuroscience, accompanied by a minor in psychology from Rutgers University. During her earlier education at Camden Community College, Natalia delved into philosophy, psychology, and sociology. Currently serving as a graduate assistant in the school psychology department, Natalia is actively involved in training fellow students to implement academic and behavioral interventions in underserved schools. Over the past 2 years, Natalia has immersed herself in researching gun violence in schools, focusing particularly on student school shooters. Her research endeavors aim to comprehend the motives, at-risk behaviors, and characteristics associated with incidents involving weapons in schools. The overarching goal of Natalia's work is to achieve early identification and implement evidence-based intervention methods that can effectively reduce school gun violence. In her research, Natalia employs mixed methods with a pragmatic lens, emphasizing the importance of integrity in data collection, analysis, and interpretation. Her approach seeks to dismantle systems of oppression within academia, reflecting a commitment to fostering positive change. And with that, Natalia, welcome. I turn it over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Kelly, and thank you so much for overseeing my literature review. I'm going to share my screen for a moment, if it lets me. Okay. Okay, and I want to say special thanks to Dr. James Connell, who is my mentor and has been supporting my research for the past 3 years. I hope you can all see you can see the literature review. Okay, good. All right, so tonight I have a very brief and to the point presentation. I thought that it would be important to begin by talking to you about my background research. It's a couple pilots that I conducted in the past couple of years and introduce you to some of those preliminary findings so that you understand why I thought it would be important to conduct this literature review. And then once I do that, I'll tell you about what I found in this literature and a special focus on what I did not find, which ended up being the more important factors that will have future implications for my research. So previously, I conducted a descriptive analysis of school shooter databases with a focus on categorizations of key characteristics and motives. So that means that I was not focused on what happened in the incidents or what happened after, but rather what led to the actions and behaviors of the perpetrators, antecedents, and context. I began by creating a very clear definition of what I call a student school shooter, which I define as an active student that for any given reasons, whether intentional or accidental, discharges a weapon in school grounds. So I am not interested in talking about mass murders that choose a school as a target, or love quarrels that happen on school grounds, or teachers shooting other teachers. I am mostly particularly focused on students who engage in gun violence. So I compiled the data from 2,058 school-related shootings starting in the year 1970 up until May 2022. And I am currently expanding to include the years 2023 and 2024. Once I created my own database, I applied my own exclusion and inclusion criteria to only include students who engage in school shootings. And as you can see, the categorizations that I came up with and the actual papers included 150 incidents. So that is a lot of data that was convoluting those results, and why many people may say that creating a profile for a school shooter is difficult. Because if you include mass murderers and teachers shooting other teachers, then the data gets very convoluted. So I simplified it, I created my exclusion inclusion criteria, and I ended up analyzing this 150 incidents. So what I came up with, and I'm not gonna bother you with the really long article, but the main focus here is that once I have my definition of a school shooter, I found these categories of the main motives behind the incidents. So I define them into two major groups, one that I title opportunistic, because these are students who have the weapons readily accessible at home or within their family members. So they engage in shootings very soon after a triggering incident. So we have accidental, which is when students bring the weapons. In over 54% of the cases, the students' weapons fire from their backpacks, either because they get triggered with some objects in there, or they sit down too hard, or they drop the backpack. And so the rest of the cases, actually, they get fired from their pockets. Then we have the suicidal group, which, as you may think, oh, aren't they planning their suicides for a period of time? They actually are not. Adults plan suicides. Children tend to be very spontaneous in nature with their suicides. Something happens to them, they get upset, they get triggered, they go home, they bring the weapons to schools and choose school grounds to end their lives. And then we have crimes of passion, in which the students are upset at a teacher, at the principal, at a peer who instigates an argument. And in many, actually the majority of the cases, about 84% of them, the students go home the same day, retrieve the weapons, they know where the guns are, and they bring them to schools and retaliate. So I call this opportunistic because the weapons are readily accessible, they're not planning these attacks, they're spontaneous in nature. And the other group I call methodological, because these are the students who take their time to plan their attacks. They take weeks up to months sometimes planning how they're going to get their guns, how they're going to save money to buy their weapons. Many of them are now 3D printing their weapons. Some of them are buying parts and putting the weapons together. And now they're including explosives as well. So there are two groups in here. I title one Rage, because these are students who are angry at the world. They have expanded their hatred from one peer to an entire group, from one girl to all women, from one teacher to the entire staff. And then we have the group which is psychopathies, where we are talking about children who experience the obvious, that you may think, narcissistic personality disorders, sociopathy, psychosis, bipolar disorder, attention deficit disorders. Now, Overall, each group has very distinct characteristics for the perpetrators. However, there were some major overlapping characteristics for all of them, and these are depression, bullying, isolation, access to weapons, trauma, PTSD, psychopathy, and psychosis. And as you can see, a lot of these things, what they have in common is mental health. So this brought me to this brought me to create literature reviews for each of them. And I am working particularly in bullying and depression. The bullying I'm revisiting again. And in this case, I wanted to know what are the actual major psychological diagnoses or medications that the students are diagnosed with or they're taking. However, this brought me to these questions. What does the research say about this mental health? What are the actual mental health issues identified? And are there any limitations in this type of research? And as I will present later on, you will find that I was able to discuss very broadly the limitations on the research, but I was not able to obtain a lot of research pertaining to the actual mental health of the perpetrators, their diagnoses, their psychological profiles, and if they were taking any medications. This is not readily available. So the literature review, these are the methods that I use. So again, I was focused only on the perpetrators and the mental health prior to the incidents. And as I first began to apply my exclusion criteria, I got really excited because I received 213 research papers that were discussing mental health in school shooters. But as I began to read them, I found that it was talking about the survivors and the teachers and the communities. And this is important information, but it's not what I was looking for. So again, I began by excluding and including only peer-reviewed academic journals. I wanted to make sure that we're talking about depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorders, isolation, bullying, etc. And of course, I am only including papers in English. And I use PubMed, ERIC, the Drexel Library, and Google Scholar. And once I applied all these initial screenings and I got this 213 original documents, I was excited. But then once you start excluding after the incidents, I only had 19 research papers. And when I began to read those 19 research papers, I found that 7 of them actually were talking about mass murders. So we're talking about adults who choose a school as a target for their violent behaviors. And I was not interested in those cases. So after I eliminated those, I ended up only including 12 research papers for my literature review. And if you're thinking that seems very low, I agree with you. This means that we are not talking about these issues as much as we should. So these are some of the findings that were the most important. I'm going to move something here real quick. So overall research examining psychological profiles of school shooters highlights the recurring theme of depression, anxiety, trauma, and psychopathy. Dodwell and al. Emphasize the profound effect of bullying. I actually used this article in several of my research papers and literature reviews because it really talks about how bullying serves as a catalyst for depression, social withdrawal, and how it escalates into greater violence in every reiteration. So you offend me, I am offended, I retaliate, now you retaliate back, and every time we escalate into greater and greater violence. Then Leary et al. Investigated how teasing and rejection further influence violent behavior in schools. This is a very cited document in many of the researchers that I actually talk about this. Peterson et al. Talk about the mental health conditions such as hopelessness, despair, and how they manifest in warning behaviors. There is a term in school shooting research that we call leakage, And leakage implies all these things the students do before they engage in shooting that serve as warnings. So blogging, vlogging, poetry, art, music, talking to peers, that is all called leakage or research. And Peterson et al. Talks a lot about that, and I thought that was really important. Langford et al. Also argue that shootings are extended suicides. Now, this helped me really frame my group of suicides in the opportunistic category, because they talk about how not only they want to end their lives, they are so angry at the world that they said, I'm taking someone else with me. Then we have the identification of those behavioral warnings and more leakage as prevention for school shootings. So how is it that we are not seeing these warning signs soon enough or creating interventions soon enough to prevent these issues? So Peterson again and all these other researchers talking about how important it is to recognize these pre-incident indicators, including social isolation, explicit expressions, which is that leakage, and unresolved trauma. Then Bascuel, I'm torturing this poor name, revealed that most school shooters experience significant stressors and losses before their attacks, suggesting a tipping point where psychological distress becomes unmanageable. And Dansley and Peterson talk that unresolved trauma coupled with depression often amplifies the risk of violence. So again, we're talking about the warning signs and how many schools actually are not trained to truly look at those warning signs. And another issue that I found is that we have counselors who are supposed to be counseling 500 students are now counseling 1,500 students. We have only one school psychologist per school, sometimes one school psychologist for 2 schools. And so we're not training our paraprofessionals to really see and be able to understand the signs or intervene. Then we have systemic environmental factors, which take on those issues of understaff in schools and how they shape those mental conditions that precede school shootings. So Folman et al. Highlight how systemic failures such as the insufficient mental health care and access and societal normalization of violence exacerbate individual vulnerabilities. Swanson et al. Further revealed the intersections between mental health crises and the criminal justice, demonstrating how untreated mental health illnesses can escalate into violent behaviors, particularly when coupled with social isolation and stigmatization. Implementing policy reforms such as universal mental health screenings in schools and reducing barriers to access mental health care is crucial for addressing the systemic challenges. So what did I not find? So what am I not talking about? And actually, this is the most important thing that I found is what I did not find. I'm not talking about actual criminal or profiles or the psychological profiles of these perpetrators. I'm not talking about actual diagnosis. I'm not talking about what the medications were that they were taking, if any. And that's because I could not find it. So the consensus among many of the scientists was that the CDC and the FBI actually have this information, but they're not releasing it to the public. They're not publishing about it. And if you're asking yourself why, and conspiracy theories are popping into your head, I am with you. Because this probably talks about the control of pharma and how much we don't want to scare the public into not taking their antipsychotic medications or not taking their antidepressants or not taking their ADHD medications. Because if we start talking about how these children may possibly have reacted to these medications, then we're creating some sort of panic. So for future implications, I do tend to steer the pot, and I do want to address the actual mental psychological factors affecting the students and whether or not if they're taking medications. One of the major limitations that I also found in this research is that a lot of the research is conducted through open sources. So they're using articles and media reports and news reports to talk about the mental health of the students. But when we do that, we're not actually spreading data, whereas we're simply speculating what he said, what she says, what he thinks, what the mom thinks. We're not talking about actual clinical profiles. So how would you approach this gap in the research? What do you hypothesize may be the reasons why mental health is not being researched directly with the perpetrators? And do you have any suggestions about how I would address my IRB? And if you have any questions. And that really is it for me tonight. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nat. We have a few minutes at this point that we can take some questions for Natalia from our attendees. You can put your question in the chat, or if you would like to open your microphone, you may ask the question directly. Well, Natalia, you know I always have a question. And as I do most of my work in international spaces as well as gender spaces, I am curious about those two areas. I know this was not an explicit part of your literature review or the questions you're asking, but I'm wondering how prevalent this kind of research is in other contexts outside the US. If you happen to have seen things that you're looking at, and if there are differences at all. And the second question I have is, how much of this research is also about gender? Are boys and girls being researched the same way, treated the same way, thought about in the same way in the research, or is that not even a question at all?
So I found that according to what I found, is that gender tends to be redacted when the children are very young. However, when we do start talking about gender and when it is not redacted, there is an increase in suicides among young women and a decrease in the ages of the male students. So it used to be 14, 15, 16-year-olds engaging in this incidents, but now it is 9, 10, 11 years old. And for the accidental category that I have, it is the youngest children, first grade, second graders, who bring the weapons to schools, who do not understand the repercussions of these actions and engage in accidentally misfiring the weapons. But there has been an increase in young women engaging in gun violence. As far as international, due to the what can we say, the spread of the USA popularity and the media, now it is increasing in other countries. Now, other countries tend to have different gun policies, so it is more difficult for them to engage in gun violence in schools. So they tend to use other types of violent behaviors. For example, in Japan, there are no guns, but then there are more stabbings and chokings and strangulation. So then you find differences in those violent behaviors, and I do tend to explore those in the future.
Great. You have one question in the chat. It is from Megan Jacobs. Megan, did you want to open your mic and ask your question out directly?
Sure. Yeah, I have it's bedtime in my house and I have two sad kids who are not excited that it's bedtime. So I thought I would put it in the chat just in case the microphone was kind of not safe. I first of all, thank you so much for sharing your work. It's really interesting to hear about all that you've learned. I was curious if the Freedom of Information Act might be a kind of access point that if because you had that information that I think you kind of rightly identified would be really helpful to kind of shed some light on in your report. And if like you had suggested that there were state bodies who who had the information. I don't know anything about FOIA, but I understand that that is how people can get information that they seek sometimes.
So there is this one major researcher, his name is Dr. Peter Langman, and he's the most cited researcher in this field. And he has just begun in the past couple of years to use the Freedom of Information Act to retrieve actual criminal cases. But then he just published a new book talking about how even these are redacted and how they go bypassing all the HIPAA violations and this and this and that, and they don't give him the entirety of the records. Even the records themselves are redacted, and they're particularly redacted when they're talking about the mental health of the perpetrators and whether or not they were taking medications. So I am trying to bypass it by engaging directly with the perpetrators. My future steps are questionnaires and interviews, which is going to be a very interesting process and tedious. But if I can get that information directly from them, then I don't have to worry about redacted information. If they're willing to share, I'm going to take it. So yes, we can get the criminal records, we can get the actual interviews with them, but a lot of the stuff gets redacted anyway.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, if any, or comment or suggestion.
Yes, I take it.
If none, we'll let people sort of simmer with this information because it's a really fascinating study. So thank you, Natalia, for sharing tonight. I
My
look forward to
pleasure.
watching this progress, and hopefully you'll be back in a year or two and presenting some of the findings from your research.
You got it. Thank you all for being here.
Our second presenter tonight is Dr. Lauren Villanueva, and their presentation title is Should I Stay or Should I Go? Gendered Experiences of Retention in Institutional Advancement. Lauren is a higher education advancement leader with 2 decades of experience in alumni engagement and fundraising. As Vice President of Alumni Engagement and Annual Giving at Syracuse University, she serves on the executive leadership team with the Office of Advancement and External Affairs. In this role, Lauren leads a dynamic and comprehensive program focused on building lasting relationships with Syracuse global alumni community of over 300,000 individuals. Her leadership has been instrumental in surpassing both alumni engagement and donor acquisition goals during the university's recently concluded $1.5 billion Forever Orange campaign. Joining Syracuse University in July 2022, Lauren served as Assistant Vice President and Executive Director of the Alumni Board of Governors at Drexel University. I think that was supposed to be prior to joining. Okay. There she developed and implemented she developed and implemented strategic initiatives to enhance volunteer engagement, program development, and data management. She contributed to the success of the Drexel's $750 million The Future is a Place We Make campaign. Lauren holds a Bachelor of Arts in Communications, a Master of Science in Higher Education Administration and Organizational Management, and an EDD in Educational Leadership and Management, all from Drexel University. So we'll call her a triple dragon. Her doctoral research focused on talent management within higher education advancement, with a particular emphasis on the experiences of women in fundraising and alumni engagement roles at private doctoral institutions. Lauren has been an adjunct instructor in Drexel School of Education and College of Arts and Sciences, and has served as a subject matter expert and workshop facilitator for academic impressions. She enjoys engaging with other advancement professionals as a volunteer and speaker with the Council for Advancement and Support for Education, that is CASE, if you've heard of that, and other professional organizations. So at this point, welcome, Lauren. I will turn it over to you. Thank you for presenting your research.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Kelly, for that introduction and for all of your mentorship and guidance along my doctoral journey, which I completed in June, although it feels like a very long time ago already. So I'm going to share some of the highlights and findings from my research, which, as Dr. Kelly said, had focused on the experiences of women in the institutional advancement field. So just to give a little bit of context for where my study is situated, institutional advancement, for folks who might not be familiar with the term, is sort of the administrative unit of higher education institutions that focuses on fundraising, alumni engagement, and sometimes marketing and communications. We can trace the origins of this field really back to the 17th century, when Yale University became one of the first institutions to have an approach to alumni engagement, reaching out to their alumni to find out what they were up to after they were graduating, and then disseminating a newsletter to tell other people about that. But it's really only been a recognized profession for the last 50 years, when CASE, which Dr. Kelly mentioned in her intro, was established to set some standards for the profession and to bring folks who were doing this work together. So there were two things that really were interesting to me when I approached my study, and I kind of structured it around these two ideas. One, we know that turnover is very high among folks who work in institutional advancement. This is for a variety of reasons. A lot of times it's cited that there's lack of career advancement opportunities in the field. There's unrealistic expectations about how much money can be raised or how many folks can be engaged. Leadership doesn't, always provide the resources to be able to meet those goals. And then there's burnout associated with doing this work. There's a lot of nights and weekends and intense pressure, and folks find themselves either leaving for other roles or leaving the field entirely. And this is problematic because our work is based on relationships, right? So if a fundraiser leaves, or if an alumni engagement professional leaves, someone else has to come in and basically reestablish relationships, reestablish a program, and that can cause people to delay their engagement and philanthropy. So for institutions that are in the business of raising larger and larger sums of money, this is really problematic when you see turnover happening and have it not be addressed in a proactive way. The other thing that was of interest to me is that there's a growing body of research on identity and advancement, including the importance of the diverse identities and lived experiences that staff bring to the work. And when I was doing my literature review and the background for my study, this quote really stood out to me. And it really speaks to the idea that, in prior generations of higher education, it was white, it was male dominated, right? And now we're seeing on our college campuses increased diversity in all forms. And folks, when they're thinking about engagement with an institution or thinking about making a gift, they want to help people who are like them or have similar backgrounds. So it becomes important to have sort of a match between the demographics of our donor base and the folks who are doing the work. And I chose to sort of focus specifically on the experiences of women in this context, one, because of my own experience, lived experience in the field, and also because we see that women are graduating from degree programs at higher rates than men. So they now control a great deal of the world's wealth, and they exert a great deal of influence on philanthropy as compared to prior generations. So they're really positioned to become a significant constituency for supporting higher ed. The other piece of this, though, that's interesting to me is that although women hold most of the professional roles in advancement, in some segments of the work, it's, upwards of 70% in alumni engagement, for example, their representation is still disproportionately low when you think about senior leadership, the chief advancement officer level, the person who's really setting the strategy for the work that's conducted on behalf of the institution. And so we see also women of color also hold even fewer roles in the advancement field, 16% of roles at the professional level, and then only 4% in leadership positions. So I was really interested to understand what draws women into the field and the numbers that we see them, but why do we see this sort of lack of representation at the leadership level? So the purpose of this study was to really understand the lived experiences of women who are in fundraising and alumni engagement roles at private doctoral institutions, and the factors that support their retention in this context, right? Because I wanted to understand what could we do to mitigate turnover and also, really ensure that folks who are coming into the field, and women in particular, have a positive experience and want to continue to do this work. So I framed my study using 3 foundational theories, which you see here on this slide. I wanted to understand if the unfolding model of turnover that we see in the literature to explain how people make decisions about their work applied in this context. So that really talks about the idea that employees look at their current role and evaluate it against alternative opportunities when they decide to stay or go. It's usually not just a drop of the hat decision that they're going to leave. There's this kind of decision-making process that happens. I also wanted to look at this in the context of the job embeddedness theory, which talks about both the on and off the job factors that folks weigh when they're really thinking about, do I want to stay in this role or do I want to pursue something else? And then because this study was looking at the experiences of women, I anchored my research and the lens at which I looked at my findings to Joan Acker's theory around gender organizations, which says that gender is shaped and is shaped by organizational structures, practices, and policies. And sometimes gender can intersect with these things to become the basis for discrimination, bias, and inequity. And for the purposes of this study, of course, gender is understood as intersectional. Gender is not the only identity we bring to our work. There are going to be other factors from race to religion to sexual orientation that may interact with gender to compound discrimination and inequity as well. So I really was, thinking about the 3 theories that existed to frame my study, and then tried to think about the gap that I wanted to fill with my work and what was really missing. So when you look at the theories that are out there, including the unfolding model of voluntary turnover and job embeddedness, they're context and identity neutral, right? A lot of these theories were developed and then refined and tested in the corporate sector, and we try and apply them to other settings, nonprofit, higher ed, but they're not really contextualized for that purpose. And at the time that they were developed, again, you're looking at a lot of organizations that were white and male dominated, so we can't really say that theories that are applied to that specific population are going to apply to everyone. And in the lens of Acker's work, she talks about this idea that these models and then the systems, that sort of grew out of those were developed on sort of this conceptualization of the unencumbered white man, right? Like somebody who didn't have any family or caregiving responsibilities outside of work, so they could bring their full self to the organization and to their career journey. And that doesn't necessarily explain how women or folks from other identities are going to experience the organization. Of course, we also know that labor market trends and the way people think about work has changed since these models were created. You can go back to the 40s and the 50s to see kind of the origins of these models. And that was when folks were really loyal to their organization. They found a job after college or out of high school and they stayed there, right? And we know that there's a lot more mobility in the job market right now, and then particularly in fields like advancement, where there's a lot of competition for talent and folks really moving between institutions. So there's not that sense of loyalty. And then finally, looking at the existing literature, I found a lot of studies that were framed around how to tell leaders and managers basically how to manage the talent that they had to either get them to stay or to get them to perform better. But there really weren't a lot of studies that centered the individual voices of employees. And in the context of higher education, a lot of the work around talent management was centered around faculty, not administrative staff, and there were very few studies. I only found one in the context of my literature review that looked at the experiences of women. So I felt that I had a gap to fill here with my research. So these were the 3 research questions that I framed my study around, wanting to understand how participants describe their work as an institutional advancement professional and what ways that work might be gendered. The factors that participants identified as being important to their decisions whether to stay or leave from their jobs, and then the ways that they suggest that the field could better support them both personally and professionally. So I took a phenomenological approach to the research. This was a qualitative study. I really wanted to explore what people were experiencing within their organizations and how they experienced it to be able to come up kind of, with sort of the essence of this phenomenon of retention in the field. And I wanted to allow multiple participants to be able to tell their stories, think about and reflect their experiences, and then really work together to co-create new knowledge. So I structured my study around one-on-one interviews first to kind of gain insight into people's individual experiences, and then conducted focus group interviews to find out where were the places where there was sort of mutual agreement about the things that were important to sort of that personal and professional fulfillment and satisfaction. So for my study criteria, The people that I invited to participate in my study had to identify as a woman. They had to be employed in a fundraising or alumni engagement role at a private institution for at least 3 years. The literature says right now that the average sort of tenure for somebody in a fundraising role is between 18 and 24 months. So I wanted to talk to people who had stayed a little bit longer than the average, and they had to have experience with making a job-related decision process, whether they decided to leave or they ultimately decided to stay. And I recruited participants from my study from a community of practice that I'm a part of folks that serve alumni engagement and fundraising roles at private institutions. Ultimately, I enrolled 8 people in my study. This slide just sort of breaks down the demographics a little bit. You can see by race, by experience that people had in the field, which really ranged from early career to more senior, and then by job-related decision making. So the majority of participants, 5 of them that I interviewed, actually stayed within their institution, whether they moved up to a higher level role or they changed job functions, which is, as I'll talk about in my findings, something that was interesting to me when I really looked at the outcomes from my study. This slide just shows a little bit about how I approach the data collection and analysis process. As I said, I use the one-on-one interview to really explore the first and second research question, which were about people's lived experiences and job-related decisions. And then using first and second cycle coding methods, I isolated some of the key themes about those lived experiences, and the ones that surfaced across all 8 interviews I used to inform the protocol for my focus groups, where we really looked at in small groups of about 3 to 4 people each, really looked at the factors where there was mutual agreement around these are the things that have promoted a positive personal and professional experience for me, and this is what we want to see more of in the field. So really those focus groups were used to kind of create that description of what makes people stay in their roles, and of course that informed the findings, conclusions, and recommendations for practice. So to take us through the findings, the first finding that came out of the data I collected was that there's a lot of gender stereotyping that happens in the field. So the participants that I talked to, many of them had transitioned into advancement from other areas of higher education. And when they were making that decision, they reflected on people who said to them, "You're really good at talking to people. You like to plan events. You like to help people," right? And that was sort of what led them to explore the field. And I sort of asked the question, do you think men get the same messages? And the sort of consensus was they get a lot of messages about this field is a place where you can be competitive. This is very data driven, because it's connected to closing gifts. So right away, we start to see folks sort of stereotyped into certain roles. And that creates kind of pathways into different functions within the field. So as I said at the beginning of the presentation, there are some disciplines within advancement, alumni engagement being one of them, where you've got 70 to 80% of the field is women, right? And the folks in my study reflected on the fact that a lot of women are directed in towards those engagement roles that emphasize events, that emphasize community building, that emphasize helping, and not necessarily into the fundraising roles that are, maybe a little bit more seen as a little bit more competitive. And because of this, there's been differing levels of value that have been assigned to these roles. And a couple of participants talked about this idea that the work completed by alumni engagement professionals is usually compensated and benchmarked and valued and seen as bringing value to the organization, less so than those fundraising roles. So there's this difference between, work that is seen as feminine and work that is seen as masculine. And a couple of the participants in my study did talk about this idea that they saw, inequity. Personally, had experienced inequity in promotions and salary and compensation as compared to either male colleagues or folks who were doing work that was typically defined as more masculine, right? So this gap between fundraising and alumni engagement roles and compensation. The second finding spoke to the idea that participants are making gender choices as it relates to their career journeys in this field. So the majority of participants in my study, 7 out of 8 of them, talked about this idea that they wanted or needed flexibility in their work because they had responsibility for caretaking, whether that was for children, whether that was for siblings, whether that was for elderly parents. So they needed to know that they could work from home if they needed to, that they could, decline the opportunity to travel. They really needed to make sure that they would keep that flexibility. So many of them were looking at alternative roles at other institutions, but if they perceived that they weren't going to find the same level of flexibility in those new roles, they stayed where they were. And so that sort of aligned with sort of that unfolding model, how people think about alternative opportunities, as well as the job embeddedness model, because they were kind of sticky, to use the word that Mitchell uses from the theory. They were sticky in their roles because of the links that they had to their family, to their caregiving responsibilities. They needed a job that was going to fit in alignment with those. And if they perceived that they were going to have to sacrifice those aspects of the work experience to do that, they were less inclined to take a new role. And so making these decisions based on flexibility to fulfill caregiving needs reinforces the role of women as primary caregivers, and so is a gender choice. And there was a lot of discussion within focus groups about this idea of, declining opportunities for career advancement, declining opportunities for higher salary, because they didn't want to have to sacrifice those things. So many participants did not recognize that the field was gendered in this way. Especially if they represented a dominant gender and racial identity. So the white women in my study didn't necessarily recognize that they were making gender choices, that there were aspects of the organization, that were disadvantaging them, right, in a way. So they were seeing their organizations as gender neutral and their experience as very normal. But participants who had another aspect of their identity that could be used as the basis for bias, discrimination, or inequity were more likely to recognize or articulate the impact of that on their experience. And we did see from this, particularly in the focus group, this discussion that, there's some intersectional inequality regimes that exist within this field. So there is sort of bias, inequity, and discrimination on the basis of gender, which is compounded for folks that are, that have racial diversity, diversity in terms of sexual orientation, that might have a disability. So there was a lot of discussion around how all of those other aspects of identity were interacting with other aspects of the organization and limiting career mobility in that way. And one of the other interesting things that came out of this study is this idea that because some of the staffing structures are really lean in advancement, there was this feeling that, if organizations are not staffed appropriately, the responsibility for picking up the slack if there's a staffing gap or picking up the extra work was disproportionately falling to women, and then they weren't being recognized or seen or compensated for those things. So just to get into a little bit of the conclusions of my study, to answer the research questions, how participants saw their work as an IA professional and the ways in which the work was gendered. Again, as I've talked about, not all participants who represented the dominant social identities in the field could perceive the impact of this inequality. They might not have been able to discern the extent to which gender was really impacting their experience in the field unless they were also experiencing compounded discrimination due to some other aspect of their identity. Just because they couldn't see it doesn't mean that organizations or the field is gender neutral, doesn't mean that it's friendly to women, just because we see a lot of women in this field, because we do see the gender segregation, pay and promotion inequity, and this gendered choice that I talked about in the findings. Participants identified a few factors as being important to stay or leave their jobs. Flexibility was a huge part of that. Work-life integration and the ability to balance that, was paramount. Again, 7 out of the 8 participants really talked about that and was the deciding factor in the work in their job-related decisions. And then we sort of, in the focus groups in particular, really delved into ways in which the field could better support folks personally and professionally. Really some evidence within these interviews and focus groups that there are some organizational systems that contribute to bias, inequity, and discrimination. And there was sort of a feeling that there's, and in the literature and then in the data I collected, a feeling that, the institutions or the field is trying to address this, right? Because we've got diversity programs, we've got family-friendly work arrangements, but those aren't really going deep enough to address the root cause, or they're, unequally applied across organizations and situations. So there really needs to be kind of a more critical exploration and commitment to dismantling these systems. So just to wrap up with a few recommendations from my study and some things I'm thinking about now. The first thing is really just engaging leaders, managers, and staff in a collective effort to look at the systems and structures and processes that marginalize individuals based on their identity. So really asking everyone within the field to kind of come together and think critically about some of these structures that have been reinforced over time and have this impact. The second is to really think about the ways that we can enhance career pathways for women in the field to start to close this leadership gap, being more transparent in terms of promotion and career advancement, and then thinking about ways for people to evolve their roles over time so that they don't necessarily need to leave the institution to obtain job satisfaction. So making the structure a little bit more mobile in terms of as people's interests and career goals change, how can organizations and leadership and management work with them so that they can grow where they are. And then the third recommendation is really to think about research, advocacy, and access that are going to improve outcomes for IA professionals, right? So whether that is leveraging the capacity of CASE and other professional organizations, looking at future research. I've just listed a couple of different avenues there that I would love to take my research further in the future around, thinking about different role types, different types of institutions, other aspects of social identity, and then some comparative studies that would include other gender identities. So I've got a couple of things on this slide that I'm thinking about in terms of what's next, future research designs, what other factors might we be able to explore to better understand the culture and advancement and its impact on retention. And then are there other strategies that you've seen perhaps from areas of higher education or education that you come from that could be effective in addressing issues like what surfaced in this study? So those are some things that I'm thinking about as I think what to do next with my research, and I'd welcome any other questions or comments.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lauren. We now have a few minutes to open the floor to questions and comments from participants. Feel free to put your question in the chat or open your mic and you can ask your question directly. Lovely comments coming in.
Thanks, everyone.
Comments, questions, suggestions for Lauren on where else she should be researching, other areas, dissemination. Question coming in from Kristen Betts.
Yes, so thanks for the question, because I've been thinking a lot about where where I want to go with this. So I have been speaking with someone who is a co-editor on the professional journal for our field, Education and Philanthropy, and so I'm hoping to submit for that. The other thing that I am working on right now came out of this study. I connected with someone at University of Texas, Austin, who has similar research interests to mine. Her study was also called Should I Stay or Should I Go? And she looked at retention of gift officers. And one of the things that we really came to together when we first connected was that sort of topic I went to at the beginning of the presentation, where the models that we have right now are context and identity neutral. And so one of the things we've been doing is we've combined our research interest into a framework for more human-centered talent management, we're calling it. And we have been asked to publish it in Case Currents, which is our industry publication. So sort of related to my research, but also having the opportunity to work with someone else has been pretty exciting too. So I'm exploring all avenues, and yes, I'm presenting my research at Case in mid-February at the District 2 conference in New York City. So I submitted my dissertation findings and results, and they picked it up for a presentation. So that's pretty exciting.
Congratulations. That's wonderful.
Thank you. Oh, thanks, Mona. It's good to see you on here.
Well, if there are no other questions, thank you both to our presenters, Natalia and Lauren, for sharing your research this evening. I'd like to thank everyone for attending the Colloquium event series, and the 2024-25 Colloquium series will now be available the first Mondays of the month. Except for this one, we moved it back to accommodate the early start of the term. But we'll be meeting next month on the first Monday, which is February 3rd, and we'll be starting again at 7:30. I hope you will all join us and hear our presenters next week. Thank you again.